The sun of Austerlitz would rise. But none knew it yet. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 2nd, 1805, a thick mist hung over the Moravian countryside like a heavy blanket, muffling sounds and obscuring the movements of 170,000 men who would soon decide the fate of Europe. The air was cold, sharp against the face, carrying the scent of frost and the distant smoke of countless campfires where soldiers huddled, waiting for the dawn that would bring either glory or death. Napoleon Bonaparte stood atop the Zuran hill, his greatcoat pulled tight against the morning chill, his eyes scanning what little could be seen through the impenetrable fog. At 36, he was at the height of his powers, his mind working with the precision of a master clockmaker, each thought clicking into place with mechanical certainty. Around him, his marshals and aides moved quietly, their horses' hooves making soft thuds in the muddy ground, their voices hushed whispers that barely carried beyond their small circle. The emperor had been awake since 3 in the morning, poring over maps by candlelight in his tent, making final adjustments to a plan that had been months in the making. Every ridge, every stream, every farm building on this battlefield had been studied, memorized, incorporated into his grand design. He knew that somewhere out there in the mist, the combined armies of Austria and Russia were preparing to attack, convinced they had found weakness in the French right flank, eager to exploit what they believed was Napoleon's greatest mistake. But there were no mistakes in Napoleon's plan. The apparent weakness was deliberate, a trap as carefully constructed as any steel-jawed snare. The French right, commanded by Marshal Davout, had been deliberately weakened, pulled back from the strategic village of Telnitz, abandoned to create the illusion of vulnerability that would draw the Allied attack exactly where Napoleon wanted it to fall. It was a dangerous gamble, one that required perfect timing and unwavering trust in his subordinates, but Napoleon had built his reputation on such calculated risks. The mist swirled around them like living smoke, so thick that a man could barely see his own hand extended in front of his face. It was a gift from the weather gods, this fog, providing perfect concealment for the final movements of his grand strategy. Somewhere in that white void, 73,000 French soldiers were moving into their assigned positions, guided by carefully trained officers who had memorized every step of the march in the weeks leading up to this moment. Marshal Soult's 4th Corps occupied the critical center of the French line, positioned below the Pratzen Heights that rose like a sleeping giant from the mist-shrouded landscape. These heights would be the key to everything that followed, the prize that would determine victory or defeat. Napoleon had studied the terrain for weeks, walking every yard of it during the army's approach march, noting how the ground sloped, where water collected, which approaches offered the best footing for charging cavalry or advancing infantry. The Pratzen Heights dominated the entire battlefield, a long, rolling plateau that rose nearly 200 feet above the surrounding countryside. From its summit, artillery could command every approach, infantry could see for miles in clear weather, and cavalry could launch devastating charges down the gentle slopes toward either flank. It was the kind of terrain that military theorists wrote about in their academic papers, the perfect example of key ground that must be seized and held at all costs. But Napoleon's genius lay not in recognizing the obvious importance of the heights, any competent general could see that, but in understanding how to use his enemy's recognition of that importance against them. The Allied commanders, led by the Austrian General Weyrother, had also identified the Pratzen Heights as the key to the battlefield. Their plan called for a massive assault on the French right while holding the heights with a minimal force, confident that Napoleon would not dare attack uphill against prepared positions. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. In the Allied camp, nearly 90,000 Austrian, Russian, and minor German state troops were stirring to life in the pre-dawn darkness. The two emperors, Francis of Austria and Alexander of Russia, had placed their trust in their senior commanders, men who had fought in the wars against revolutionary France for over a decade. These were experienced soldiers, veterans of countless campaigns, but they were about to face an opponent who thought differently than any general they had previously encountered. General Weyrother, the Austrian chief of staff who had crafted the Allied battle plan, was a methodical man who believed in the power of careful preparation and overwhelming force applied at the point of enemy weakness. His plan was logical, conventional, and exactly what Napoleon hoped he would devise. The main Allied attack would fall on the French right wing, rolling up Napoleon's flank and cutting his army off from its line of retreat to Vienna. Meanwhile, secondary attacks would pin the French center and left, preventing Napoleon from shifting forces to meet the main threat. It was the kind of plan that military academies would approve, textbook warfare executed by professionals who understood the established principles of 18th-century battle. But this was no longer the 18th century, and Napoleon Bonaparte had rewritten those principles with his own blood and genius across a dozen European battlefields. The fog continued to swirl and thicken as the morning hours crept by, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that seemed to muffle not just sound but time itself. Soldiers on both sides found themselves speaking in whispers, unconsciously lowering their voices as if they were in some vast cathedral where loud noises would be sacrilege. The normal sounds of an army preparing for battle, the rattle of equipment, the neighing of horses, the shouted orders of sergeants, all became muted, distant, dreamlike. French scouts moved like ghosts through the white void, creeping forward to observe enemy movements, slipping between Allied picket lines with the skill of professional hunters. These men had been handpicked for their ability to move silently, to observe without being seen, to remember and report every detail of what they discovered. They brought back word that confirmed Napoleon's expectations. The Allies were indeed massing for their attack on the French right, stripping defenders from the Pratzen Heights to reinforce their main assault. Colonel Savary, one of Napoleon's most trusted intelligence officers, materialized out of the mist like a specter, his horse's hooves making no sound on the soft ground. He had spent the night moving between French outposts, coordinating the reconnaissance effort that would give Napoleon his final picture of Allied dispositions. His report was brief, precise, and exactly what the Emperor had hoped to hear. "Sire," Savary whispered, his breath visible in the cold air, "they are moving as you predicted. Heavy columns are marching toward our right. The heights are being abandoned except for a thin screen of pickets." Napoleon nodded, his face invisible in the darkness but his satisfaction evident in the set of his shoulders. Everything was proceeding according to plan. The trap was set, the bait had been taken, and soon the spring would snap closed with devastating force. But there were still hours to wait, hours of nervous tension while nearly 200,000 men maneuvered in the fog, each side believing they held the advantage. The Emperor dismounted and walked a few paces away from his staff, seeking a moment of solitude before the storm broke. In the distance, he could hear the faint sounds of an army in motion, the creaking of wagon wheels, the muffled conversations of soldiers, the occasional whinny of a horse, but the sounds seemed to come from another world, filtered through the thick white curtain that had descended over the battlefield. This was the moment Napoleon loved most, the calm before the tempest when all the planning and preparation hung in the balance, waiting for the first shot to transform potential energy into kinetic violence. He had experienced this feeling at Rivoli, at Marengo, at a dozen other battlefields where his tactical genius had turned apparent defeat into crushing victory. Each time, there had been this same mixture of anticipation and certainty, the knowledge that he had laid his trap well and that his enemies were walking into it with perfect confidence. The Allied army was indeed moving, though their movements were as blind as those of men walking through a cave. General Weyrother's carefully planned assault was beginning to unfold, with massive columns of infantry and cavalry feeling their way forward through the fog toward what they believed would be a decisive attack on the French right wing. Bagration's Russian advance guard was already probing forward, seeking the French positions around Telnitz and Sokolnitz, the villages that anchored Napoleon's supposedly vulnerable flank. But these villages were not as lightly defended as they appeared. Marshal Davout's Third Corps, though outnumbered, was composed of some of the finest soldiers in the French army, men who had marched 700 miles from the Rhine to reach this battlefield in time. They were veterans of Italy and Egypt, soldiers who had learned to trust their emperor's genius even when his plans seemed to court disaster. They knew their role was to bend but not break, to give ground grudgingly while making the Allies pay dearly for every yard of advance. As the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the fog, the outlines of the battlefield began to emerge like shapes in a dream. The mist still hung thick and heavy, but here and there, patches of clearer air revealed glimpses of the forces gathering for battle. French soldiers could be seen moving in silent columns, their dark blue uniforms making them nearly invisible in the pre-dawn gloom. Allied troops in their white and green coats moved like phantoms through the swirling fog, following guides who led them toward their assigned positions. The weather itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the violence to begin. There was no wind to stir the mist, no rain to turn the battlefield into a quagmire, nothing to interfere with the deadly choreography that was about to unfold. The temperature hovered just above freezing, cold enough to keep the ground firm underfoot but not so cold as to freeze the mechanisms of muskets and cannon. Napoleon returned to his horse and mounted with the easy grace of a man who had lived in the saddle for 20 years of almost constant warfare. Around him, his staff was making final preparations, checking watches, reviewing signals, ensuring that every detail of the coming battle would unfold according to the Emperor's design. Marshal Berthier, the chief of staff whose organizational genius had made possible so many of Napoleon's victories, was quietly confirming that all units had received their final orders and were in position. The fog began to shift and swirl more actively as the sun climbed higher behind its concealing veil. Occasionally, brief gaps would open in the white curtain, revealing tantalizing glimpses of the enemy forces moving in the distance. Allied cavalry could be seen massing in dark columns, their sabers and lance points glinting dully in the filtered light. Artillery pieces were being wheeled into position, their crews moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had served their guns through countless battles. But these glimpses were fragmentary, incomplete, like pieces of a vast puzzle that could not quite be assembled into a coherent picture. Both armies were essentially fighting blind, relying on their scouts and their predetermined plans rather than the evidence of their own eyes. It was a situation that favored the defender, and Napoleon intended to exploit that advantage to its fullest extent. The sound of distant drums began to echo through the fog, the measured beat that signaled the beginning of a general advance. The Allied assault was finally beginning, their massive columns lurching into motion like some great machine that had been wound up and released. Thousands of boots began to squelch through the muddy fields, keeping time with the drums that provided the only reliable way to maintain formation in the blinding fog. Napoleon listened to those drums with the ear of a master musician, identifying the rhythm and pace that told him exactly how his enemies were deploying their forces. The heavy, regular beat indicated infantry in line formation, moving slowly and deliberately toward their objective. The lighter, more rapid drumming revealed cavalry preparing to charge, their mounts pawing the ground in eagerness to be unleashed. The deeper boom of military bands playing marching songs told him where the enemy commanders were positioning themselves, using music to guide their troops through the white maze. "They come," whispered Marshal Lannes, his scarred face barely visible in the gloom. The Marshal of France was one of Napoleon's oldest companions, a man who had shared the emperor's rise from the chaos of revolution to the heights of European power. His voice carried no anxiety, only the calm anticipation of a professional soldier who had seen too many battles to be nervous about one more. Napoleon nodded but said nothing, his attention focused entirely on the sounds filtering through the fog. Every noise carried information for those who knew how to interpret it, the jingle of harness telling him where cavalry was moving, the rumble of wheels revealing the position of artillery, the scattered pop of musket fire indicating where his skirmishers were making contact with the enemy advance guard. The first phase of the Battle of Austerlitz was beginning, but it was still hidden in the white void that enveloped the battlefield like a shroud. Soon, very soon, that fog would begin to lift, and when it did, the world would see the full genius of Napoleon's trap revealed in all its deadly perfection. The mist continued to swirl and eddy around them, a living thing that seemed to pulse with its own mysterious life. But already Napoleon could sense the change coming. The air was beginning to stir, the first faint breath of wind that would eventually sweep the fog away and reveal the tableau of battle in all its terrible clarity. When that moment came, when the sun of Austerlitz finally broke through the clouds and illuminated the field, the fate of Europe would be decided in a few short hours of violence that would echo through history for generations to come. But for now, there was only the mist, the waiting, and the gathering storm of war that was about to break over the peaceful Moravian countryside with all the fury of a thunderbolt hurled by the gods themselves. The fog seemed to have a life of its own, breathing and shifting like some vast, slumbering creature that had settled over the battlefield to watch the drama unfold. As the minutes ticked by, Napoleon could feel the pulse of his army around him, 73,000 men moving with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Each regiment, each battalion, each company knew its role in the grand design, and they moved to their positions with the confidence of men who trusted absolutely in their emperor's genius. Marshal Soult's Fourth Corps was the keystone of Napoleon's plan, positioned below the Pratzen Heights like a coiled spring waiting to be released. The marshal himself, a stocky man with graying hair and the weathered face of a career soldier, rode among his troops in the pre-dawn darkness, offering quiet words of encouragement and checking that every detail was in order. His men were some of the finest in the Grande Armée, veterans who had fought from the pyramids of Egypt to the forests of Germany, and they would need every ounce of their experience in the hours to come. The Fourth Corps was arranged in a formation that would have seemed suicidal to conventional military thinking. Instead of deploying in the usual defensive lines, Soult's divisions were massed in column formation, ready to launch an immediate assault the moment Napoleon gave the signal. It was an aggressive stance for troops supposedly on the defensive, but Napoleon's plans had never followed conventional wisdom. Where other generals saw weakness, he saw opportunity. Where they sought safety, he courted calculated risk. General Van Damme's division anchored the right of Soult's position, their bayonets fixed and ready despite the impenetrable fog that made traditional battle formations almost meaningless. These soldiers had learned to fight by sound and instinct when visibility failed, trusting their officers' voices and the touch of their comrades' shoulders to maintain unit cohesion. They stood in patient silence, their breath creating small clouds in the cold air, each man lost in his own thoughts about the battle to come. Private Laurent Dubois of the 24th Light Infantry crouched behind a low stone wall, his musket cradled in his arms, listening to the distant sounds of the Allied approach. At 19, he had already seen more battles than many soldiers experienced in a lifetime, having enlisted during the desperate days when all of Europe seemed arrayed against revolutionary France. The fog that surrounded him was both blessing and curse. It concealed his position from enemy eyes, but it also meant he would have no warning when the attack came. Beside him, Sergeant Moreau, a grizzled veteran of the Italian campaigns, cleaned his musket with the methodical care of a man who knew his life might depend on its reliability. "Stay calm, lad," the sergeant whispered, his voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the army. "The Emperor knows what he's doing. He always does." Dubois nodded, though the sergeant couldn't see the gesture in the darkness. He had heard the stories of Rivoli and Marengo, battles where Napoleon had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat through sheer audacity and tactical brilliance. But this felt different somehow, more dangerous, as if they were walking a tightrope over an abyss with no safety net below. Further to the left, General Saint-Hilaire's division waited in similar readiness, their officers moving quietly along the lines, checking equipment and offering words of encouragement. These men would form the left wing of the assault on the Pratzen Heights, and their success or failure would determine whether Napoleon's gamble paid off or whether the Grande Armée would be destroyed piecemeal by superior numbers. The sounds from the Allied lines were growing louder now, more distinct. The creak of leather and jingle of metal spoke of cavalry moving in large formations. The rhythmic tramp of marching feet, muffled but unmistakable, revealed infantry columns advancing through the fog toward their jump-off positions. Most ominous of all was the rumble of artillery wheels, gun crews struggling to maneuver their pieces through the muddy fields in preparation for the bombardment that would precede the assault. Napoleon's face remained impassive as he processed these sounds, but his mind was working with the speed and precision of a master chess player calculating moves dozens of steps ahead. Each noise confirmed another element of his analysis of Allied intentions. They were indeed committing their main strength to the attack on his right flank, exactly as he had predicted. General Weyrother's plan was unfolding with the mechanical precision of a clockwork toy, and like a clockwork toy, it could be wound up, manipulated, and ultimately broken by someone who understood its mechanism. Colonel Savary materialized again from the fog, his horse moving with the quiet step of an animal trained for reconnaissance work. His latest report confirmed what Napoleon's ears had already told him. The Allied assault columns were forming up for their attack, massing nearly 40,000 men for the hammer blow that would supposedly crush the French right wing. The Russians are moving in strength towards Sokolnitz, Savary reported in his quiet, professional voice. Bagration's advance guard is already engaging our outposts. The Austrians are concentrating near Telnitz. They mean to roll up our entire right flank. Excellent, Napoleon replied, and there was genuine satisfaction in his voice. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. The bait had been taken, the trap was closing, and soon it would be time to spring the snare with devastating effect. But the waiting was the hardest part. Napoleon had learned long ago that the moments before battle were often more difficult than the combat itself. Once the fighting began, training and instinct took over, but these final minutes of preparation required iron self-control and unshakable confidence in one's own judgment. Around him, he could sense the tension radiating from his staff officers, good men who trusted his genius, but who could not help feeling nervous when facing odds of nearly 2-1. Marshal Murat, the flamboyant cavalry commander whose dashing charges had broken enemy lines from Italy to Austria, sat his horse nearby, his elaborate uniform somehow still immaculate despite the muddy conditions. His cavalry reserve was positioned behind the center of the French line, ready to exploit whatever breakthrough Napoleon's infantry might achieve. Murat lived for moments like this, when the fate of empires hung on the courage of men and horses charging into the unknown. The ground will be good for cavalry once this fog lifts, Murat observed, his voice carrying the eager anticipation of a hunting hound straining at the leash. These Moravian fields are perfect for a charge. Napoleon nodded but said nothing. Murat's enthusiasm was both a strength and a weakness. His cavalry charges were legendary throughout Europe, but his impetuous nature sometimes led him to attack before the optimal moment. Today would require perfect timing, and Napoleon intended to keep his cavalry reserve under tight control until exactly the right instant. The fog was beginning to show signs of movement now, stirring and shifting as the sun climbed higher behind its white veil. Occasionally, brief gaps would open in the mist, revealing tantalizing glimpses of the battlefield beyond. Here and there, the dark shapes of buildings could be seen, farmhouses and barns that would soon become strongpoints in the coming battle. The spires of village churches rose like ghostly fingers from the White Sea, their bells silent on this morning of war. To the north, the village of Belowitz lay hidden in the mist, its streets empty of civilians who had fled the approaching armies. These simple farming communities had become pawns in a game of empires, their fields about to be watered with the blood of men who had marched hundreds of miles to fight over ground they had never seen before. Such was the nature of war in this age of professional armies and imperial ambition. The Allied drums were beating more insistently now, their rhythm speaking of final preparations and imminent advance. Through the fog, Napoleon could hear the voices of enemy officers shouting orders in German and Russian, their words unintelligible but their urgency unmistakable. Somewhere in that white void, 90,000 men were preparing to attack, confident in their numerical superiority and the conventional wisdom of their battle plan. But Napoleon had built his career on overturning conventional wisdom. Where other generals saw the prudent course, he saw opportunity. Where they sought to minimize risk, he courted calculated danger in pursuit of decisive victory. His greatest triumphs had always come when he was outnumbered and seemingly trapped, forced to rely on speed, surprise, and the superior morale of his troops to overcome material disadvantage. The Grande Armée that surrounded him in the fog was the finest military instrument Europe had ever seen. These were not the raw levies of the early revolutionary wars, but professional soldiers trained to a standard of excellence that had no equal. They had marched across Europe in perfect order, living off the land and moving with a speed that left their enemies gasping. They were Napoleon's sword, sharp and perfectly balanced, ready to strike with devastating precision at his command. Captain Coignet of the Imperial Guard crouched near Napoleon's position, his veteran eyes scanning the fog for any sign of enemy movement. At 32, he was older than most soldiers, a man who had followed Napoleon from his earliest campaigns and had earned his place in the elite guard through courage and loyalty. The guard was Napoleon's personal reserve, 6,000 of the finest soldiers in the world, and they would not be committed to battle unless the situation was desperate or the opportunity for final victory was at hand. "Sire," Coinet whispered, "the men are ready. They have been ready since midnight." Napoleon turned slightly in his saddle, acknowledging the captain's report with a slight nod. The Imperial Guard's readiness was never in question. These men would charge into hell itself if their emperor commanded it. But today, Napoleon hoped their sacrifice would not be necessary. If his plan worked as intended, the battle would be won by Soult's assault on the heights, not by the blood of his precious guard. The mist continued to swirl around them, but Napoleon could sense the change coming. The air was beginning to stir more actively, and here and there, patches of clearer atmosphere revealed glimpses of the landscape beyond. The sun was climbing steadily behind the clouds, and soon its rays would begin to burn away the fog that had provided such perfect concealment for his preparations. Marshal Lannes rode up from his position on the French left, where his Fifth Corps was holding the line against any Allied attempt to turn that flank. His weathered face showed the strain of command, but his voice was steady as he made his report. "The Austrians are probing our positions near Blasewitz," he said quietly. "Nothing serious yet, just reconnaissance in force. But they're definitely planning something on our left as well." Napoleon absorbed this information without surprise. Weyrother's plan called for secondary attacks to pin the French flanks while the main assault crushed their right wing. It was textbook military doctrine, the kind of coordinated assault that had worked effectively in the previous century's wars. But this was Napoleon's century now, and he had rewritten the rules of warfare with his own genius and the blood of his enemies. The sounds of battle were beginning to drift through the fog from the south, where Marshal Davout's Third Corps was engaging the first elements of the Allied assault. The popping of musket fire, irregular but increasing in intensity, told of skirmishers making contact and testing each other's strength. Soon, that scattered firing would build into the continuous roar of battalion volleys, and the real battle would begin. Davout's men had their work cut out for them. They were outnumbered nearly 3-1, facing the combined might of Russian and Austrian columns advancing with all the confidence of overwhelming superiority. But these were veterans of Ulm and a dozen other battles, men who had learned that numbers alone did not determine victory. They would fight with the skill and determination that had made the Grande Armée the terror of Europe. Private Rousseau of the 33rd Line Infantry lay flat behind a hedgerow near Sokolnitz, listening to the approaching enemy with growing unease. The fog made everything seem dreamlike and unreal, but the sounds were becoming more distinct with each passing minute. He could hear Russian voices now, harsh and guttural in the cold air, and the metallic clink of bayonets being fixed to muskets. Beside him, Corporal Benet checked his cartridge box for the 10th time, ensuring that his ammunition was dry and ready for use. The corporal was a veteran of Egypt, a man who had seen the pyramids and fought under the desert sun, and his calm demeanor helped steady the younger soldiers around him. "Remember your drill," Benet whispered to the men nearest him. "Wait for the order, aim low, and reload fast. The fog won't last forever, and when it lifts, we'll give these Russians a welcome they won't forget." The tension was becoming almost unbearable now, stretched taut like a bowstring drawn to its full extent. Both armies were in position, both commanders had made their final preparations, and now everything waited on the lifting of the fog and the first shot that would transform potential energy into kinetic violence. Napoleon checked his watch, a gift from Josephine that he carried into every battle. 7 o'clock was approaching, and with it would come the dawn light that would finally reveal the full scope of the battlefield. The sun of Austerlitz was about to rise, and when it did, the fate of Europe would be decided in a few short hours of concentrated violence. The Allied assault was beginning in earnest now. Through the fog came the unmistakable sound of massed infantry advancing in line formation, their drums beating the rhythm of attack, their officers shouting encouragement and orders. Thousands of boots squelched through the muddy fields, moving with the inexorable momentum of a tide that seemed impossible to stop. But Napoleon was ready for them. His trap was perfectly prepared, his soldiers positioned with mathematical precision, his timing calculated to the minute. Soon, very soon, the Allied commanders would discover that their apparent advantage was actually a fatal weakness, and that the master of the battlefield was about to teach them a lesson in the art of war that they would never forget. The mist began to stir more actively, responding to the first breath of wind that would eventually sweep it away completely. And in that stirring, Napoleon could sense the approaching moment when all his planning would be put to the ultimate test. The Battle of Austerlitz was about to begin in earnest. 2. The Allied assault begins. The pace quickens slightly as the fog starts to lift and the first shots ring out across the battlefield. 7:15 in the morning. The first pale rays of sunlight began to penetrate the fog, creating an ethereal landscape of shifting shadows and half-glimpsed forms. It was as if the battlefield existed in some liminal space between dream and reality, where the laws of the physical world seemed suspended and anything might materialize from the white void without warning. But the sounds were becoming more real, more immediate, more threatening with each passing moment. The crack of a single musket shot echoed across the fields, sharp and clear in the cold air. Then another, and another. The skirmishers were making contact at last, French light infantry engaging the advance elements of the massive Allied columns that were feeling their way forward through the thinning mist. These first shots were like drops of rain before a thunderstorm, harbingers of the deluge of violence that was about to descend on the peaceful Moravian countryside. Napoleon felt the familiar surge of energy that always came with the beginning of battle. The waiting was over. The pieces were in motion. Now everything would depend on the execution of his plan and the courage of his soldiers. He raised his telescope, trying to peer through the fog toward the sound of firing, but the mist still obscured everything beyond a few hundred yards. He would have to rely on his ears and the reports of his scouts to follow the opening moves of the battle. Near the village of Austerlitz, Marshal Davout's advance guard was engaging the leading elements of General Dokhturov's Russian division. The Russians came forward in their traditional columns, massive formations of men in long gray coats and tall mitre caps, moving with the methodical precision that had made the Imperial Russian Army one of the most feared forces in Europe. Their drums beat steadily, providing the rhythm for their advance, while their officers rode alongside shouting orders in the harsh, guttural Russian that seemed to carry so well in the cold morning air. Captain Thibault of the 108th Line Infantry crouched behind a low stone wall on the outskirts of Austerlitz, watching the ghostly forms emerging from the fog. The Russians appeared gradually, like figures materializing from another world, first as vague shadows, then as recognizable human shapes, and finally as individual soldiers with faces visible beneath their military caps. There were so many of them, an endless gray tide flowing toward his small force of light infantry. "Steady, lads," Thibault called to his men, his voice calm despite the odds they faced. "Let them come closer. Wait for my command." The French soldiers pressed themselves lower behind their improvised fortifications, checking their muskets one final time and trying to control the nervous energy that always preceded combat. These were veteran troops, men who had fought from the Channel coast to the Danube, but the sight of those massed Russian columns was enough to make even experienced soldiers question their chances. 50 yards, 40, 30. The Russians came on with machine-like precision, their bayonets glinting dully in the filtered morning light. Thibault could see their faces now, young men mostly, peasants from the vast Russian steppes who had been conscripted into service for the Tsar. They looked as nervous as his own soldiers, but they continued their advance with the stoic courage that characterized Russian infantry. "Fire!" Thibault shouted, and 30 muskets erupted in a ragged volley that sent balls of lead whistling into the Russian ranks. Men fell, screaming and clutching their wounds, but the column barely paused. The survivors stepped over the bodies of their fallen comrades and continued forward, closing the distance with each stride. The French began reloading with desperate speed, ramming powder and shot down their musket barrels while the Russians approached inexorably. There would be time for one more volley, perhaps two if they were lucky, before the enemy was upon them with cold steel. It was the eternal equation of 18th century warfare: firepower versus shock action, discipline versus courage, experience versus numbers. The second French volley was more ragged than the first, as some men finished loading before others and fired as soon as they were ready. More Russians fell, but still they came on, their own muskets leveled and ready to return fire. The gap between the opposing forces narrowed to 20 yards, then 10, and suddenly the air was full of Russian musket balls, humming like angry bees as they sought French targets. Private Leclerc felt something tug at his sleeve and looked down to see a neat hole in his uniform where a ball had passed within inches of his arm. There was no time to reflect on his narrow escape, however, as the Russians were almost close enough to use their bayonets. Around him, his comrades were falling back from the wall, trading space for time as they had been trained to do. This was exactly what Napoleon had planned. Davout's men were not supposed to stop the Russian assault. That would have been impossible given the odds they faced. Instead, they were to delay it, to force the enemy to deploy from column into line, to make them fight for every yard of ground while drawing more and more Allied forces into the attack on the French right wing. The village of Austerlitz changed hands twice in the first hour of fighting, French defenders falling back through the narrow streets, while Russian infantry surged forward, their officers urging them on with sword and voice. The sound of fighting echoed off the stone walls of houses and barns, creating a cacophony of musket fire, shouted orders, and the screams of wounded men that could be heard for miles across the fog-shrouded battlefield. Meanwhile, to the south near Telnitz, Austrian forces under General Kienmayer were launching their own assault against the French positions. These troops moved with the mechanical precision that had characterized the Austrian army for generations, their white uniforms ghostly in the mist, their movements coordinated by the complex system of drill and discipline that had made them the backbone of every coalition against revolutionary France. Colonel Margarin of the 3rd Line Infantry watched the Austrian advance from his position behind a hedgerow, counting the enemy battalions as they emerged from the fog. There were far too many of them, but that was according to plan. Every Austrian soldier committed to this flank attack was one less man available to defend the Pratzen Heights, and it was those heights that would determine the outcome of the battle. The Austrians attacked with methodical courage, their volleys delivered with parade ground precision even under fire. Their white-coated infantry advanced in perfect lines, pausing to fire and reload with mechanical efficiency before continuing their forward movement. It was impressive to watch, like some elaborate military ballet performed on a stage of mud and blood. But the French defenders were not impressed by military pageantry. They had learned to fight in the brutal school of revolutionary warfare, where survival depended on practical skill rather than ceremonial precision. They used every feature of the terrain to their advantage, falling back from position to position, making the Austrians pay for every advance while conserving their own strength for the crucial moment when Napoleon would need them. The fog was lifting more rapidly now, burned away by the strengthening sun and stirred by a gentle breeze that had begun to blow from the east. Visibility improved from yards to hundreds of yards, and for the first time since dawn, the opposing commanders could begin to see the full scope of the battle developing around them. From his position on the Zuran Hill, Napoleon could now observe the Allied assault unfolding exactly as he had predicted. Through his telescope, he could see the massive Russian columns pouring toward Sokolnitz, their gray uniforms dark against the white fog that still clung to the lower ground. To the south, Austrian whitecoats were visible advancing against Telnitz, while further north, other Allied forces were moving to pin his left flank near Blasowitz. Magnificent, Napoleon murmured to himself, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. The Allied plan was being executed with textbook precision, every movement coordinated according to the established principles of 18th-century warfare. General Weyrother had done his work well, creating a comprehensive battle plan that should have guaranteed victory against any conventional opponent. But Napoleon Bonaparte was not a conventional opponent. He had built his reputation on doing the unexpected, on turning the rules of warfare inside out and using his enemy's own strengths against them. The massive Allied assault that was now developing against his right flank was not a threat to be feared. It was an opportunity to be exploited. Marshal Berthier rode up with the latest reports from the French commanders engaged in the fighting. The news was mixed but encouraging. Davout's men were falling back as planned, giving ground grudgingly but maintaining their cohesion. The Russians were advancing but slowly and at great cost. The Austrians were making similar progress near Telnitz, but their attack was becoming strung out and disorganized as they fought their way through the French defenses. "How long can Davout hold?" Napoleon asked, his eyes never leaving the battlefield that was gradually becoming visible through the thinning fog. He estimates 2 hours, perhaps 3 if the enemy doesn't concentrate their full strength against him, Berthier replied. His men are fighting magnificently, but they cannot hold forever against such odds. Napoleon nodded. 2 hours would be more than enough. By then, the Allied reserves would be fully committed to their flank attack, the Pratzen Heights would be virtually undefended, and the moment for his counterstroke would have arrived. Everything was proceeding according to schedule, but the cost was already becoming apparent. Through his telescope, Napoleon could see French wounded being carried to the rear, their blue uniforms stained with blood, their faces pale with shock and pain. War was never clean or easy, no matter how brilliantly planned. Men would die today so that France could dominate Europe, and Napoleon felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders like a lead cloak. The Russian artillery had found the range now, and cannonballs were beginning to fall among the French positions with increasing accuracy. The deep boom of 12-pound guns echoed across the battlefield, followed by the whistle of shot and the crash of impact. One ball smashed into a stone wall near Napoleon's position, sending chips of rock flying in all directions and causing several horses to rear in panic. "Perhaps we should move to a safer position, sire," suggested Marshal Duroc, Napoleon's Grand Marshal of the palace, a man charged with protecting the emperor's person even in the heat of battle. Napoleon shook his head. "Not yet. I need to see how this develops." His presence here, visible to the soldiers fighting below, was worth more than personal safety. The men needed to know that their emperor shared their dangers, that he was willing to risk his own life for the glory of France and the Grande Armée. General Bagration's Russian advance guard was pressing harder now, their assault on Sokolnitz intensifying as more troops arrived on the field. These were some of the finest soldiers in the Russian army, men who had fought the Ottomans in the Black Sea campaigns and had learned their trade in the harsh school of frontier warfare. They came forward with the patient courage that characterized Russian infantry, advancing into the teeth of French musket fire without flinching. Captain Marbot of the 7th Hussars galloped up through the lifting fog, his horse lathered with sweat and his uniform torn by a musket ball that had passed too close for comfort. He had been observing the Russian advance from close range, and his report confirmed what Napoleon's eyes were already telling him. "The Russians are committing everything to this attack," Marbot reported breathlessly. "I count at least 20 battalions advancing on Sokolnitz alone, with more coming up from their reserves. They mean to break through here at all costs." "Excellent," Napoleon replied, and his staff officers exchanged glances at the emperor's obvious satisfaction with what should have been alarming news. But they had learned to trust his judgment, even when his plans seemed to court disaster. Let them come. The more they commit to this attack, the weaker they make themselves elsewhere. The Allied plan was working perfectly from Napoleon's perspective. General Weyrother had concentrated nearly 40,000 men for his assault on the French right, stripping defenders from the center and left to create the overwhelming force he believed necessary to crush Napoleon's flank. It was logical, methodical, and exactly what Napoleon had hoped his enemy would do. By 8 o'clock, the fog had lifted enough to reveal the full magnificent and terrible spectacle of the Battle of Austerlitz in all its glory. The Moravian countryside had been transformed into a vast theater of war, with nearly 200,000 men maneuvering across miles of fields and villages in formations that would have done credit to a parade ground. The Allied assault on the French right had reached its climax. Russian and Austrian forces were attacking with everything they had, their columns stretching back for miles as reserves moved forward to reinforce the assault. The sound of battle had become a continuous roar that could be heard for 20 miles, a symphony of destruction composed of musket volleys, artillery bombardments, and the shouts of men locked in mortal combat. But Napoleon's attention was no longer focused on the fight for Sokolnitz and Telnitz. His eyes were fixed on the Pratzen Heights, that commanding ridge that dominated the center of the battlefield. The heights that General Weyrother had stripped of defenders to provide troops for his flank attack. The heights that were now defended by little more than a screen of pickets and a few companies of Austrian infantry. The heights that Napoleon was about to seize with a devastating assault that would split the Allied army in half and turn apparent defeat into crushing victory. Marshal Soult received the preparatory order at 8:15. A simple message that would change the course of European history, Prepare to advance on the heights. Await my signal. The sun of Austerlitz was beginning to shine through the dissipating mist, and soon it would illuminate one of the most brilliant tactical victories in the annals of warfare. The trap was about to be sprung with all the devastating force that Napoleon's genius could devise. 3. The strike at the center. The tempo builds to a crescendo as Napoleon unleashes his master stroke. 9 o'clock in the morning. The moment had arrived. Napoleon raised his telescope one final time, scanning the Pratzen heights that rose before him like a sleeping giant waiting to be awakened. The morning mist was finally beginning to clear, revealing the gentle slopes and commanding summit that would determine the fate of Europe. Through the dissipating fog, he could see the thin line of Austrian pickets scattered across the heights, pitifully inadequate to defend such crucial terrain. General Weyrother's gamble had failed before the first shot of the main assault was fired. In his eagerness to create an overwhelming force for his flank attack, the Austrian strategist had committed the cardinal sin of warfare. He had abandoned the key terrain that controlled the entire battlefield. The Pratzen heights, which should have been held by at least 2 full divisions, were now defended by barely 1,000 men. Napoleon lowered his telescope and turned to Marshal Soult, who sat his horse nearby with the patient demeanor of a professional soldier awaiting orders. The marshal's weathered face showed no emotion, but his eyes held the gleam of a man who understood that he was about to participate in something extraordinary. Around them, the sounds of battle continued to echo from the south, where Davout's heroic defense was drawing more and more Allied forces into the trap. "Marshal Soult," Napoleon said, his voice carrying clearly despite the distant rumble of artillery. "The sun of Austerlitz illuminates your path to glory. Take the heights." The order was simple, direct, and would echo through military history for generations to come. Soult saluted with the precision of a man who had spent 30 years in service to France, then wheeled his horse around to rejoin his waiting divisions. The Fourth Corps had been poised for this moment since before dawn, 26,000 of the finest soldiers in Europe ready to execute the most audacious assault in the annals of warfare. The signal gun fired at exactly 9:05, a single cannon shot that cut through the morning air like a thunderclap. It was the sound that 70,000 French soldiers had been waiting to hear, the moment when months of planning and preparation would be transformed into action. Along the French line, drums began to beat the advance, their rhythm steady and inexorable as destiny itself. General Van Damme's division stepped off first, emerging from the morning mist like phantoms materializing into reality. These were veterans of a dozen campaigns, men who had marched from the Rhine to the Danube and had learned to trust absolutely in their emperor's genius. They moved forward in column formation, bayonets fixed, their blue uniforms dark against the pale grass of the Moravian countryside. Behind them came Saint Hilaire's division, equally veteran, equally determined. These soldiers represented the very best that revolutionary France had produced, citizen soldiers who fought not for pay or plunder, but for the glory of their nation and the genius of their emperor. They had transformed the art of war through their courage and discipline, and today they would prove once again that the Grande Armée was the finest military instrument the world had ever seen. The Austrian pickets on the Pratzen heights watched in growing alarm as the French columns emerged from the mist below them. Captain von Stutterheim of the 4th Austrian Line Infantry realized with a sinking heart that his small force was about to face an assault by numbers that dwarfed his own by at least 20-1. He had perhaps 50 men to defend a position that should have been held by 5,000. "Mein Gott," whispered Sergeant Brenner, an old soldier who had fought the Turks and the French and had thought he had seen everything war could offer. "There are so many of them." Von Stutterheim drew his sword, the steel ringing as it cleared the scabbard. There was nowhere to retreat to, no reinforcements coming to their aid. The main Austrian army was miles away, committed to the attack on the French right flank that was supposed to win the battle. His handful of men would have to face the French assault alone, and they would sell their lives as dearly as possible. "Form square," he ordered, his voice steady despite the odds they faced. "Fix bayonets." "We are Austrian soldiers, and we do not yield." The French advance gained momentum as it climbed the gentle slopes of the Pratzen heights. The soldiers moved with the fluid grace of men who had been trained to perfection, their formations maintaining perfect alignment despite the broken ground and the enemy fire that was beginning to reach out toward them from the Austrian positions. Lieutenant Coynet of the 96th Line Infantry felt his heart pounding as he led his men up the slope, their boots finding purchase on the frost-slicked grass. This was what he had trained for, what every soldier in the Grande Armée lived for, the moment when individual courage would be tested in the crucible of battle. Around him, his men moved with grim determination, their faces set in the expression of professionals going about their deadly business. The Austrian defenders opened fire when the French were still 300 yards away, their muskets crackling in a ragged volley that sent lead balls whistling through the morning air. A few French soldiers stumbled and fell, but the assault continued without pause. 300 yards became 200, then 100, and still the blue-coated columns pressed forward with unstoppable momentum. Napoleon watched the assault unfold through his telescope, his face impassive but his mind calculating every detail of the advance. The timing was perfect, the execution flawless. His soldiers were performing exactly as he had known they would, with the courage and skill that had made them the terror of Europe. But the real test was yet to come, when the Allied commanders realized what was happening and began to react to his masterstroke. The fog was lifting rapidly now, burned away by the strengthening sun and dispersed by the wind that had begun to blow more steadily from the east. For the first time since dawn, the entire battlefield was becoming visible, revealing the vast panorama of nearly 200,000 men locked in mortal combat across miles of Moravian countryside. From his command post, Napoleon could see the full magnificent scope of the battle he had orchestrated. To the south, the fighting around Sokolnitz and Telnitz continued with unabated fury, Russian and Austrian forces pressing their attack against Davout's heroic defenders. Columns of Allied troops stretched back for miles, reinforcements moving forward to join the assault that was supposed to decide the battle. But it was too late. The Allied commanders had committed themselves to their flank attack, and now they would pay the price for their conventional thinking. While 40,000 of their best troops battered themselves against Davout's stubborn defense, Napoleon was about to seize the commanding ground that would allow him to split their army in half. The French assault reached the first Austrian positions at 9:20, and the scattered defenders were swept away like leaves before a hurricane. Von Stutterheim's gallant square held for perhaps 5 minutes before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers, the Austrian captain falling with his sword still in his hand and his men dying around him with the stoic courage that characterized their army. But these small sacrifices could not stop the French tide. Vandam's division swept over the lower slopes of the Pratzen Heights like an irresistible force of nature, their momentum carrying them forward toward the summit that commanded the entire battlefield. Behind them, Saint Hilaire's men pressed forward with equal determination, ready to exploit whatever breakthrough their comrades might achieve. The first Allied commander to recognize the danger was General Collorat, whose Austrian troops were supposed to be holding the center of the line. Through his telescope, he could see the French columns swarming up the Pratzen Heights, their blue uniforms clearly visible against the pale grass. With growing horror, he realized that Weyrother's plan had left the most important position on the battlefield virtually undefended. Mein Gott, Collorat breathed, his face going pale beneath his military cap. They're taking the heights. Send word to General Kutuzov immediately. We need reinforcements, every man we can spare. But it was already too late for reinforcements. The nearest Allied reserves were miles away, committed to the attack on the French right flank or positioned to defend against threats that were no longer relevant. By the time any significant force could be assembled and marched to the Pratzen Heights, Napoleon's soldiers would be firmly established on the summit, their artillery commanding every approach. The French assault reached the crest of the Pratzen Heights at 9:35, exactly 30 minutes after Napoleon had given the order to advance. General Vandam himself led the final charge, his sword gleaming in the morning sunlight as he urged his men forward toward the summit that would give them command of the entire battlefield.
Vive l'Empereur!
The cry echoed across the heights as French soldiers poured over the crest, their tricolor standards snapping in the wind that had finally dispersed the last of the morning mist. They had achieved what military theorists would have declared impossible, an uphill assault against prepared positions that had succeeded through sheer audacity and perfect timing. Napoleon felt a surge of satisfaction as he watched his tricolor flags appear on the Pratzen Heights. The most crucial phase of his plan had succeeded beyond his wildest hopes. His soldiers now commanded the high ground that dominated the entire battlefield, and from that position, they could strike in any direction with devastating effect. The sun had finally broken through completely, flooding the battlefield with golden light that revealed every detail of the tactical masterpiece that was unfolding. The fog that had concealed Napoleon's preparations was gone, and now the world could see the full genius of his strategy revealed in all its brilliant clarity. Marshal Murat, who had been waiting with barely contained impatience for his moment to enter the battle, received the signal he had been hoping for. Napoleon's cavalry reserve was finally being committed, not to pursue a beaten enemy, but to exploit the breakthrough that would split the Allied army in half. Cavalry advance! Murat's voice carried across the field like a trumpet call, and 4,000 horsemen began to move forward with the thunder of hooves that spoke of impending doom for their enemies. These were the finest cavalry in Europe, cuirassiers in their steel breastplates, dragoons with their flowing plumes, hussars with their elaborate uniforms that somehow remained immaculate even in the heat of battle. The psychological impact of the French seizure of the Pratzen Heights was immediate and devastating. Allied soldiers who had been advancing confidently toward what they believed would be an easy victory suddenly found themselves facing the nightmare scenario that haunted every 18th century commander, enemy forces on the high ground behind them, cutting their line of retreat and threatening to destroy their army piecemeal. General Kutuzov, the veteran Russian commander who had hoped to crown his career with a victory over the upstart Bonaparte, felt his heart sink as he realized the full implications of what had happened. Through his telescope, he could see French artillery being manhandled up the slopes of the Pratzen Heights, guns that would soon be raining death down on his exposed columns. "Recall the assault," he ordered his staff, his voice heavy with the knowledge of defeat. "Pull back what we can before they cut us off completely." But orders take time to transmit across a battlefield, and time was the one thing the Allies no longer possessed. Many of their best units were too deeply engaged in the fighting around Sokolnitz and Telnitz to disengage quickly, while others were too far from their commanders to receive new orders before it was too late. Napoleon's artillery was already in action from the heights, Colonel Sennermont's guns unlimbering with the practiced efficiency of crews who had served their pieces from the pyramids to the Baltic. The 12-pounders began to speak with their deep, authoritative voices, sending round shot crashing into the packed Allied columns that were now trapped in the low ground with nowhere to hide. The carnage was immediate and terrible. Allied formations that had maintained perfect order throughout their advance suddenly found themselves under fire from an unexpected direction, their neat lines dissolving into chaos as cannonballs tore bloody lanes through their ranks. Men who had been confident of victory moments before now found themselves running for their lives, their military discipline overcome by the basic human instinct for survival. Private Dmitry Volkonsky of the Izmail Regiment had been advancing toward Sokolnitz with complete confidence when the French guns opened fire from the heights above him. The first shot passed so close to his head that he could feel the wind of its passage, and he threw himself flat on the muddy ground as more rounds came screaming down from the commanding ridge. Around him, his comrades were doing the same, the perfect formations of the Imperial Russian Army reduced to scattered groups of men seeking whatever cover they could find. Their officers rode among them, shouting orders and trying to restore some semblance of military order, but it was hopeless. You cannot maintain formation under artillery fire from elevated positions, and the French gunners were making every shot count. The sun continued to climb higher, burning away the last wisps of mist and revealing the full scope of the tactical revolution that Napoleon had wrought. What had begun as an Allied assault designed to crush the French right flank had been transformed into a rout that threatened to destroy the coalition army completely. From the Pratzen Heights, French observers could see the entire battlefield spread out below them like a vast tactical map. The Allied forces that had been so confident that morning were now scattered and demoralized, their retreat becoming more disorganized with each passing minute. Some units maintained their discipline and fell back in good order, but others had dissolved into panicked mobs that fled without regard for military protocol. Napoleon joined his victorious troops on the heights at 10 o'clock, riding up the slope that his soldiers had climbed with such magnificent courage. The men cheered as they saw their emperor, their voices hoarse from shouting but their enthusiasm undiminished by the morning's exertions. They had achieved something remarkable, something that would be remembered as long as men studied the art of war. "Soldiers of the Grande Armée," Napoleon called out, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. "You have covered yourselves with immortal glory. You have justified my confidence and exceeded even my highest expectations." The cheers that greeted these words could be heard for miles across the battlefield, a sound of triumph that spoke of victory achieved through courage, skill, and absolute trust in their commander's genius. But the battle was not yet over. There was still work to be done, still enemies to be defeated, still the final act of the drama to be played out. The Allied army was broken but not yet destroyed. Scattered groups of Russian and Austrian soldiers were still fighting with desperate courage, trying to buy time for their comrades to escape the trap that had closed around them. But Napoleon's victory was now inevitable. He had seized the key terrain, split the enemy army, and positioned his forces to complete the destruction of the coalition that had dared to challenge French supremacy. The sun of Austerlitz blazed down on a battlefield transformed, its golden rays illuminating one of the most complete and brilliant victories in military history. The fog had lifted, the heights were won, and now all that remained was to complete the masterpiece that Napoleon's genius had created. The rout was about to begin in earnest. For the Great Rout. The pace becomes more urgent as the Allied army begins to disintegrate under the weight of Napoleon's masterstroke. 10:30 in the morning. The sun of Austerlitz now blazed with full intensity, its golden rays illuminating a scene of military catastrophe that would haunt the nightmares of Allied commanders for years to come. From their commanding position on the Pratzen Heights, French artillery continued to pour devastating fire into the scattered remnants of what had once been the proud army of the Third Coalition. The morning that had begun with such confidence for the Allies had become an afternoon of unmitigated disaster. General Weyrother's carefully crafted battle plan lay in ruins, as shattered as the formations that were now streaming away from the battlefield in growing disorder. The Austrian strategist who had been so confident of victory just hours before now found himself trying desperately to salvage something from the wreckage of his grand design. But Napoleon's counterstroke had been too swift, too perfectly timed, and too devastating in its execution. The first to break were the Austrian units that had been advancing on Telnitz. These troops, already demoralized by their failure to break through Davout's stubborn defense, found themselves suddenly under fire from French guns positioned on the heights behind them. The psychological shock of being caught between two fires proved too much for men who had been fighting since dawn without achieving their objectives. Colonel von Weissenwolf of the 14th Austrian Infantry watched in dismay as his carefully maintained formations began to dissolve like sugar in rain. His men, who had advanced that morning with parade ground precision, were now running in all directions, seeking escape from the deadly crossfire that was cutting them down by the hundreds. Officers rode among the fleeing soldiers, shouting orders and waving their swords, but discipline had broken down completely. "Rally! Rally on the colors!" Von Weissenwolf called desperately, but his voice was lost in the chaos of retreat. Men who had served faithfully for years were now thinking only of survival, throwing away their muskets and equipment in their haste to escape the French guns that commanded every route of withdrawal. The Austrian retreat quickly became a rout, white-coated soldiers streaming away from the battlefield in whatever direction offered escape from the devastating artillery fire. Some units maintained a semblance of order, their officers managing to keep their men together through force of personality and iron discipline. But these were exceptions in a sea of chaos that was spreading like wildfire through the Allied ranks. Napoleon watched the Austrian collapse through his telescope, his face impassive but his satisfaction evident in the slight smile that played around his lips. This was exactly what he had planned, what he had worked toward through months of careful preparation. The enemy's numerical superiority had been turned against them, their own strength becoming the instrument of their destruction. "Marshal Soult," Napoleon called to his subordinate, who was coordinating the artillery bombardment from the heights. "Press them hard. Don't give them time to reorganize." The French guns redoubled their fire, sending round shot and canister into the packed masses of retreating Austrians. Each discharge carved bloody lanes through the white-coated ranks, leaving trails of dead and wounded that marked the path of the Allied withdrawal. The gunners worked with mechanical precision, swabbing out their pieces and ramming home fresh charges with the practiced efficiency of men who knew their trade. But it was the Russian troops who provided the most heartbreaking spectacle of courage in defeat. These soldiers, products of a military system that valued discipline above life itself, continued to fight with stubborn determination even as their situation became hopeless. Russian infantry squares formed and reformed under the most intense fire, their officers maintaining order through sheer force of will and the ingrained habits of a lifetime spent in service to the Tsar. General Bagration, the Georgian prince who commanded the Russian advance guard, found himself in an impossible situation. His men were caught in the open, under fire from the Pratzen Heights and unable to advance or retreat without suffering devastating casualties. But rather than surrender or flee, he chose to fight, organizing a series of desperate counterattacks that bought precious time for other Russian units to escape. Form square. Prepare to receive cavalry. Bagration's voice cut through the din of battle as French horsemen appeared on the flanks of his position. His soldiers responded with the automatic obedience of veterans, forming the defensive formations that had served Russian infantry well in a dozen previous wars. But this was not a previous war, and Napoleon's cavalry attacked with a coordination and ferocity that overwhelmed even the steadiest troops. Marshal Murat led the cavalry charge personally, his ornate uniform blazing with gold braid as he spurred his horse toward the Russian squares. Behind him thundered 4,000 horsemen, their sabers glinting in the morning sun, their horses' hooves creating a sound like approaching thunder. It was a sight to inspire terror in any infantry formation, but the Russians stood firm, their bayonets presented in a bristling wall of steel. The impact when it came was tremendous, the sound of horses and men colliding with prepared infantry carrying across the battlefield like a physical blow. Some Russian squares held, their disciplined volleys emptying saddles and turning back the French assault. But others broke under the impact, their formations dissolving into individual combats where cavalry enjoyed every advantage. Private Fyodor Kuzmin of the Semyonovsky Guards found himself facing a French dragoon whose saber was already red with blood. The Russian soldier parried desperately with his bayonet-tipped musket, the steel ringing as blade met blade. Around him, his comrades were fighting similar duels, the carefully ordered world of military drill replaced by the primal chaos of hand-to-hand combat. The French horseman pressed his attack, his mount trained to strike with its hooves, while its rider wielded his saber with deadly skill. Kuzmin gave ground step by step, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he fought for his life against an opponent whose advantages in mobility and reach seemed insurmountable. But Russian soldiers were trained never to yield, and he continued to fight with the stubborn courage that characterized his nation's military tradition. The duel ended when a French pistol ball took Kuzmin in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the muddy ground. As consciousness faded, he could hear the sounds of battle moving away from him, his regiment continuing its fighting retreat toward whatever safety they could find. He had done his duty as a Russian soldier, fighting to the end against impossible odds. But individual courage, however admirable, could not change the strategic reality that Napoleon had created. The Allied army was broken, its formations scattered, its command structure in chaos. What had begun as an orderly retreat was rapidly becoming a panicked flight as word of the disaster spread through the ranks and demoralized soldiers abandoned all pretense of military discipline. The most dramatic and tragic scene of the entire battle was about to unfold near the village of Satschan, where several frozen ponds had become the focus of the Allied retreat. These bodies of water, covered with a thin layer of ice that had formed during the cold December night, appeared to offer an escape route for soldiers fleeing the French pursuit. But appearances could be deceiving, and the ice was not thick enough to support the weight of men in heavy military equipment. Colonel Montrond of the 9th Hussars was among the first to reach the ponds, his regiment having been ordered to press the pursuit of the fleeing Allies. Through the dust kicked up by thousands of retreating soldiers, he could see Austrian and Russian troops attempting to cross the frozen water, their desperation overcoming their natural caution about the treacherous footing. "The ice won't hold them," observed Captain Savary, who had ridden up to observe the retreat. "It's been too warm these past few days." Even as he spoke, the truth of his prediction became horribly apparent. The first soldiers to venture onto the ice were making slow progress, their weight causing ominous cracking sounds that spoke of imminent disaster. But those behind them, pressed by the French pursuit and desperate to escape, continued to pour onto the frozen surface without regard for the warnings of their comrades. The ice gave way with a sound like thunder, a great rending crack that split the surface and plunged hundreds of men into the freezing water below. The screams of the drowning soldiers carried across the battlefield, a sound of human anguish that penetrated even the dulled sensibilities of men who had witnessed the carnage of war for hours. Austrian soldiers in their heavy white coats disappeared beneath the dark water, dragged down by the weight of their equipment and the shock of the icy immersion. Russian guards in their tall mitre caps struggled desperately to reach the shore, but the broken ice made progress almost impossible, and their wet uniforms became deadly weights that pulled them inexorably downward. Sergeant Heinrich Müller of the 23rd Austrian Infantry had been among the first to venture onto the ice, his years of mountain warfare having taught him to test each step carefully before committing his full weight. But when the ice gave way, he found himself struggling in water so cold it seemed to burn his skin like fire. His heavy pack and musket, essential tools of his trade just moments before, now threatened to drag him to a watery grave. Around him, his comrades were fighting their own desperate battles against the elements. Some managed to reach the far shore, hauling themselves out of the water with the last of their strength. Others clung to pieces of broken ice, their numbed fingers gradually losing their grip as hypothermia sapped their remaining energy. Still others simply disappeared beneath the surface, their struggles ending with heartbreaking suddenness. French artillery, positioned on the heights above the ponds, added to the carnage by firing into the masses of soldiers trapped on the ice and in the water. Colonel Sennermont's gunners, following Napoleon's orders to show no mercy to the fleeing enemy, sent round shot crashing into the crowded surface, each impact sending more victims into the freezing water below. The scene became one of indescribable horror, with hundreds of Allied soldiers drowning within sight of safety while their comrades looked on helplessly from the shore. The ponds that had seemed to offer salvation became death traps that claimed more victims than many conventional battles. It was warfare at its most merciless, where nature and human design combined to create suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. Napoleon himself rode to the edge of the ponds to observe the destruction his victory had wrought. For a moment, even the master of the battlefield seemed moved by the spectacle of human suffering spread out before him. These were brave men, soldiers who had marched hundreds of miles to fight for their countries and their emperors. They deserved better than to die like rats in a trap, but war had its own logic that transcended individual merit or courage. "Sire," whispered Marshal Bessieres, commander of the Imperial Guard, "perhaps we should call off the pursuit. They are beaten." Napoleon considered the suggestion for a moment, his face reflecting the complex emotions that command in battle always evoked. Mercy was a luxury that great commanders could rarely afford, especially when dealing with enemies who would certainly show no quarter if their positions were reversed. But there was something in the spectacle before him that touched even his iron soul. "Continue the pursuit," he ordered finally, his voice steady but lacking its usual edge of satisfaction. "But avoid unnecessary slaughter. They are beaten men, not wild animals." The order was passed down through the French ranks, but its effect was limited. The momentum of victory had unleashed forces that were difficult to control, and French soldiers who had been fighting desperately for their lives just hours before were not inclined to show mercy to enemies who had sought to destroy them. The pursuit continued with unabated vigor, driving the scattered Allied forces further from the battlefield and deeper into the Moravian countryside. By noon, the Battle of Austerlitz was effectively over. The Allied army that had numbered nearly 90,000 men that morning had been scattered to the winds, its formations broken, its command structure destroyed, and its morale shattered beyond repair. Thousands lay dead on the field, while thousands more had been captured or wounded. The ponds near Satzchan had become mass graves, their icy waters hiding the bodies of men who had drowned in the midst of battle. General Kutuzov, the veteran Russian commander who had hoped to crown his career with victory over Napoleon, found himself with barely 15,000 effective troops remaining from the force he had led into battle that morning. His army had not been defeated. It had been annihilated, destroyed so completely that it would take months to rebuild even a semblance of its former strength. The psychological impact of the defeat was even more devastating than the physical losses. The armies of Austria and Russia, which had marched to Austerlitz confident in their numerical superiority and the righteousness of their cause, had been humiliated by a force they had outnumbered nearly 2-1. The myth of French invincibility, which had been growing since Napoleon's first victories in Italy, was now established beyond any doubt. Emperor Francis of Austria, who had watched the battle from a safe distance, received the news of his army's destruction with the stoic resignation of a man who had been prepared for disappointment. The Habsburg monarchy had suffered many defeats in its long history, but few as complete and devastating as this one. The dream of containing French expansion had died on the fields of Austerlitz, and Austria would have to seek accommodation with the new master of Europe. Tsar Alexander of Russia took the defeat much harder, his youthful pride wounded by the completeness of his humiliation. He had come to Austerlitz believing that Russian valor and German method could overcome French genius, but Napoleon had taught him a lesson in the realities of modern warfare that he would never forget. The alliance that had seemed so promising just days before had been shattered as completely as the ice on the ponds of Satschan. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, French soldiers moved across the battlefield, gathering up the wounded and counting the dead. The cost of victory had been surprisingly light, fewer than 9,000 casualties from Napoleon's army, compared to nearly 30,000 Allied losses. It was a butcher's bill that spoke eloquently of the advantages that superior strategy and tactics could provide over mere numerical strength. But numbers could not capture the full significance of what had occurred on the fields of Austerlitz. Napoleon had not simply won a battle. He had demonstrated a new way of warfare that would influence military thinking for generations to come. His victory had been achieved not through superior firepower or greater numbers, but through intellectual superiority, the ability to see patterns that his enemies missed and to exploit their weaknesses with surgical precision. The Grande Army gathered its trophies as the day waned, captured artillery pieces, abandoned supply wagons, and the regimental colors that represented the honor of defeated units. French soldiers who had begun the day facing overwhelming odds now found themselves masters of one of the most complete victories in military history. They had earned their place in the annals of warfare, and they knew it. Colonel Lejeune of the Engineers rode across the battlefield as evening approached, making a preliminary assessment of the carnage for his official report. The scenes he witnessed would haunt his memory for the rest of his life: the frozen ponds with their grisly cargo of corpses, the long windrows of dead marking the path of the French cavalry charges, the abandoned equipment scattered across miles of Moravian countryside. But it was the prisoners that affected him most deeply. Thousands of Allied soldiers sat in dejected groups, guarded by their French captors, their faces showing the shock of men who had seen their world turned upside down in the space of a few hours. These were professional soldiers, veterans of many campaigns, but they had been broken by an opponent whose genius had proven superior to their courage and discipline. The sun of Austerlitz was setting now, its golden rays slanting across a battlefield transformed by the day's events. The morning mist that had concealed Napoleon's preparations was long gone, burned away by the intensity of combat and the heat of triumph. In its place lay the clear evidence of one of the most brilliant tactical victories in the history of warfare, a masterpiece of military art that would be studied and admired for centuries to come. As darkness began to fall, the last sounds of pursuit faded into the distance, and an eerie quiet settled over the field of Austerlitz. The battle was over, the victory complete, and Napoleon Bonaparte had established himself as the undisputed master of European warfare. But the consequences of this day's work would echo through history long after the last shot had been fired and the last sword had been sheathed. The empire was secure, the coalition was broken, and the old order of Europe lay in ruins as complete as the scattered remnants of the Allied army. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but tonight belonged to France and to the emperor whose genius had made this triumph possible. The rout was complete. V. The sun sets over the field. The tempo slows to a contemplative, almost melancholic pace as the day ends and the full weight of what has occurred settles over the battlefield. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The December sun hung low in the western sky, its golden rays slanting across the field of Austerlitz with a beauty that seemed almost obscene given the carnage that surrounded it. The battle was over, the victory complete, but Napoleon Bonaparte found himself strangely subdued as he rode slowly across the battlefield that had witnessed one of the most brilliant tactical triumphs in military history. The emperor had dismounted near the summit of the Pratzen Heights, the commanding position that had been the key to everything that followed. From here, he could see the entire scope of his victory spread out below him like a vast tableau of triumph and tragedy. The Moravian countryside, so peaceful that morning when shrouded in mist, now bore the scars of war in every direction: abandoned equipment, scattered corpses, and the long black lines of retreating enemies disappearing into the distance. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant cries of the wounded and the occasional crack of a musket as French soldiers put suffering horses out of their misery. It was the silence that always followed great battles, when the fury of combat gave way to the melancholy aftermath of victory. Napoleon had experienced this feeling many times before, but it never became easier to bear. Each triumph carried its own weight of responsibility and sorrow. Marshal Berthier approached on foot, his usually immaculate uniform stained with mud and powder smoke. The chief of staff's face showed the exhaustion that came from coordinating a complex battle, but his eyes held the satisfaction of a professional who had seen his work crowned with success. In his hands, he carried the preliminary casualty reports that would tell the full cost of the day's achievement. "Sire," Berthier said quietly, offering the papers to his emperor. "The butcher's bill." Napoleon took the reports and scanned them with the practiced eye of a commander who had read too many such documents. The numbers told a story of remarkable efficiency: fewer than 9,000 French casualties against an estimated 30,000 Allied losses. It was a ratio that spoke eloquently of the advantages that superior strategy could provide over brute force, but each number represented a human life, a family that would mourn, a future that would never be realized. 27,000 prisoners, Napoleon read aloud, his voice reflecting neither satisfaction nor regret, merely the acknowledgement of facts. 40 captured guns, 50 regimental standards. The mathematical precision of victory, reduced to statistics that would fill history books but could never capture the full human cost of what had occurred. The French soldiers moving across the battlefield showed the complex emotions that always followed triumph. Some celebrated with the exuberance of men who had survived a desperate gamble and emerged victorious. Others moved with the quiet professionalism of veterans who understood that today's enemies might be tomorrow's allies, and that the wheel of fortune could turn with devastating speed in the violent world of Napoleonic warfare. Captain Coignet of the Imperial Guard was among those searching for wounded comrades, his veteran eyes scanning the scattered bodies for signs of life. The Guard had been held in reserve throughout the battle, their services not required for a victory achieved through superior positioning rather than desperate fighting. But they had watched the battle unfold with professional interest, understanding better than most the tactical brilliance of their emperor's strategy. Near the base of the Pratzen Heights, Coignet found a young Austrian officer lying wounded beneath the body of his horse. The man's leg was clearly broken, and his face was pale with shock and loss of blood, but his eyes showed the alert intelligence of a professional soldier who understood what had befallen his army. "Water," the Austrian whispered in accented French, his voice barely audible above the ambient sounds of the battlefield. "Please, water." Coignet offered his canteen without hesitation, supporting the wounded officer's head while he drank. This was one of the unwritten codes of warfare, that enemies became simply wounded men requiring aid once the fighting stopped. The political and strategic considerations that had brought them to this field were irrelevant in the face of basic human suffering. "What is your name?" Coignet asked gently, settling the Austrian officer more comfortably against a piece of broken stone wall. "Lieutenant von Neuburg," the man replied, managing a weak smile despite his obvious pain. "3rd Austrian Infantry. And you?" "Captain Coignet, Imperial Guard." The French officer began examining the wounded leg with the practiced touch of a man who had seen too many battlefield injuries. "Your leg is broken, but you'll live if we can get you to the surgeons." Von Neuburg nodded, accepting the diagnosis with the fatalism that characterized soldiers of all nations. "Your emperor," he said quietly. "He is a remarkable man. We never saw it coming until it was too late." It was a sentiment being echoed across the battlefield as Allied survivors tried to comprehend the completeness of their defeat. Professional soldiers could appreciate tactical brilliance even when they were its victims, and there was widespread recognition among the defeated troops that they had been outmaneuvered by a master of the military art. Napoleon himself was encountering similar scenes as he continued his survey of the battlefield. Near the village of Sokolnitz, he came across a group of wounded Russian soldiers who had been abandoned during their army's hasty retreat. These men, products of a military system that emphasized discipline above all else, maintained their military bearing even in defeat, struggling to rise when they recognized the French emperor despite their injuries. "Rest easy," Napoleon said in his careful Russian, learned during the diplomatic exchanges that had preceded this war. "You have fought with honor. You have nothing to be ashamed of." The senior wounded man, a sergeant with gray in his beard and the weathered face of a career soldier, managed to prop himself up on one elbow. "Your Majesty honors us," he said formally, his English heavily accented but comprehensible. "We did our duty as Russian soldiers." Napoleon knelt beside the man, noting the severity of his wounds and the unlikely prospect of survival. "What is your name, Sergeant?" "Mikhail Volkonsky, sire, Preobrazhensky Guards. 30 years' service to the Tsar." The pride in the man's voice was unmistakable, the pride of a professional soldier who had devoted his life to military service and had no regrets about his chosen path. 30 years, Napoleon repeated thoughtfully. "You have seen many battles. Many, Your Majesty, but none like this one. You have taught us that war is more than courage and discipline. It requires genius." The admission came hard to a man who had been raised to believe in the invincibility of Russian arms, but honesty compelled him to acknowledge what he had witnessed. Napoleon stood slowly, his face reflecting the complex emotions that such encounters always evoked. These men had marched hundreds of miles to fight him, had been prepared to kill him and his soldiers without mercy, but now they were simply wounded warriors deserving of respect and care. War was the most human of activities and the most inhuman, and great commanders learned to live with that paradox or be destroyed by it. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the battlefield in shades of gold and crimson that seemed almost deliberately theatrical. French medical personnel were now arriving in greater numbers, establishing aid stations and beginning the grim work of sorting the wounded into those who could be saved and those who were beyond help. It was a process that required its own kind of courage, the moral strength to make life-and-death decisions based on medical probability rather than human sentiment. Dr. Larry, Napoleon's chief surgeon, approached with his characteristic brisk efficiency. The man who had revolutionized battlefield medicine through his flying ambulances and rapid treatment protocols looked exhausted but satisfied. His innovations had saved thousands of French lives over the years, and today had been no exception. "The wounded are being collected, sire," Larry reported. "We should have most of our men under care within the hour. The enemy wounded. There are so many of them. We'll do what we can, but our own men must come first." Napoleon nodded, understanding the harsh arithmetic of military medicine. "Do what you can for all of them, doctor. Courage deserves recognition regardless of the uniform it wears." As evening approached, the first diplomatic contacts were beginning to take place. Prince Liechtenstein, representing the Austrian emperor, had requested a meeting under a flag of truce. The preliminary negotiations for what would become the Treaty of Pressburg were about to begin, discussions that would reshape the map of Europe and confirm French hegemony over the continent. The meeting took place in a farmhouse near the village of Austerlitz, a humble setting for negotiations that would determine the fate of empires. Napoleon arrived with a small staff, his uniform still showing the stains of the day's work, his manner neither triumphant nor vindictive but simply businesslike. He had won a great victory, But now the political work of exploiting that victory had to begin. Prince Liechtenstein was a man of the old school, aristocratic in bearing and diplomatic by training, but he could not hide the shock of his nation's defeat. The Austrian negotiator had expected to be discussing terms for French withdrawal from Central Europe. Instead, he found himself pleading for mercy for a beaten empire. "Your Majesty," Liechtenstein began formally. "His Imperial Majesty Francis desires to end this unfortunate conflict and return to the peaceful relations that should exist between neighboring powers." Napoleon's response was polite but firm. "Peace is always preferable to war, Your Excellency. But it must be a peace that reflects the realities created by today's events. Austria chose to make war on France. Austria must accept the consequences of that choice." The negotiations would continue for hours, but their outcome was never in doubt. Austria would pay a heavy price for its participation in the Third Coalition, territorial concessions, massive indemnities, and the effective end of its role as a great power in Central Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, that thousand-year-old institution that had given shape to European politics since Charlemagne, would be formally dissolved, its place taken by Napoleon's Confederation of the Rhine. Russia, geographically protected by distance and winter, would escape with lighter punishment, but Tsar Alexander's dreams of playing a major role in European affairs had been shattered as completely as his army. The young emperor who had ridden to war with such confidence would return to St. Petersburg a wiser but humbler man, understanding for the first time the true cost of challenging Napoleon Bonaparte. As the diplomatic discussions continued, Napoleon found himself drawn back to the battlefield where the day's triumph had been won. The Pratzen Heights, so crucial to his victory, were now quiet except for the work of burial parties and medical personnel. French soldiers had erected a simple monument marking the spot where their emperor had stood when he gave the order that changed the course of European history. The view from the heights was spectacular in the setting sun, the Moravian countryside stretching away in all directions like a vast green carpet dotted with villages and farms. It was beautiful, peaceful country, the kind of landscape that poets wrote about and artists painted. But now it would forever be remembered as the stage for one of history's most decisive battles. Colonel Savary joined Napoleon on the heights, his day's work finally complete. The intelligence officer who had played such a crucial role in the morning's preparations looked exhausted but satisfied, his professional pride evident in his bearing. He had helped orchestrate a masterpiece of military art, and he knew it. "The prisoners are being processed, sire," Savary reported. "Many of them are asking to see you. They want to understand how they were defeated so completely." Napoleon smiled slightly at this. Professional curiosity was one of the characteristics that separated good soldiers from great ones, and he had always respected enemies who could appreciate tactical excellence even in defeat. "Perhaps tomorrow," he said. "Tonight belongs to our own men." The French army was indeed celebrating its triumph, but with the measured satisfaction of professionals rather than the wild abandon of amateur soldiers drunk on unexpected victory. These were veterans who had fought from the Rhine to the Danube, men who understood that today's triumph had to be consolidated by tomorrow's vigilance. They celebrated, but they also prepared for whatever challenges the future might bring. In the temporary hospitals that had been established in houses and barns throughout the area, French and Allied wounded lay side by side, their national differences forgotten in the face of shared suffering. Young soldiers who had been trying to kill each other just hours before now shared water and words of encouragement, united by the brotherhood of arms that transcended political boundaries. Private Dubois of the 24th Light Infantry, wounded in the morning's fighting but not seriously enough to be invalid home, sat beside a young Austrian drummer boy who had been shot through the shoulder. The two young men, neither more than 20 years old, communicated in a mixture of broken German and French, sharing the simple human contact that helped wounded soldiers cope with pain and fear. "Why do we fight?" the Austrian boy asked in halting French, his question carrying the weight of philosophical inquiry that often followed traumatic experiences. Dubois considered the question seriously, drawing on his limited education and extensive experience of war. "For our countries," he said finally, "for our emperors, for our comrades. Sometimes I think we fight because fighting is what soldiers do." It was a simple answer to a complex question, but it satisfied both young men. They were soldiers, products of a military age that demanded their service and their sacrifice. The reasons for specific wars might be debated by politicians and philosophers, but soldiers fought for more immediate and personal reasons: loyalty, duty, and the bonds forged in shared danger. As full darkness finally descended over the battlefield, Napoleon made his way back to his headquarters, which had been established in a requisitioned manor house near the village of Austerlitz itself. The building was alive with activity as staff officers compiled reports, processed intelligence, and began planning for the pursuit that would complete the destruction of the Allied armies. But Napoleon found himself drawn to a quiet room overlooking the battlefield, where he could contemplate the day's events in solitude. Through the window, he could see the campfires of his victorious army dotting the landscape like fallen stars, each one representing a unit that had contributed to the day's triumph. In the distance, other fires marked the positions of Allied wounded and prisoners, evidence of the completeness of his victory. The Battle of Austerlitz had been more than a military triumph. It had been a work of art, a masterpiece of strategic thinking and tactical execution that would be studied in military academies for generations to come. Every element had worked in perfect harmony. The deception that had drawn the enemy into attacking his deliberately weakened right flank. The timing that had allowed him to seize the key terrain just as his enemies committed themselves elsewhere, and the follow-through that had turned tactical success into strategic victory. But victory, even brilliant victory, carried its own burdens. Napoleon was now the undisputed master of continental Europe, but mastery brought responsibilities that were often heavier than the chains of defeat. He would have to govern the empire he had created, manage the rivalries and ambitions of his subordinates, and find ways to make permanent the dominance he had achieved through force of arms. The emperor, who had once been simply a talented artillery officer, now found himself responsible for the fate of millions of people across a dozen nations. The boy from Corsica, who had risen through merit and genius to command armies, now wore a crown that carried obligations to match its privileges. Victory at Austerlitz had confirmed his greatness, but it had also trapped him in a role that would demand everything he had to give and more. Marshal Lannes entered the room quietly, recognizing his emperor's need for contemplation but bringing news that could not wait. The marshal's weathered face showed the satisfaction of a professional soldier who had contributed to a great victory, but also the concern of a friend who understood the burdens that Napoleon carried. "Sire," Lannes said softly, "the casualty reports are complete. 8,937 of our men killed or wounded. The enemy has lost more than 30,000. Napoleon nodded without turning from the window. The numbers were remarkably favorable, testament to the advantages that superior strategy could provide over brute force. But each French casualty represented a life cut short, a family bereaved, a future unrealized. The mathematics of victory could never fully account for the human cost of war. "And the prisoners?" Napoleon asked. 27,000, as Marshal Berthier reported, including 12 general officers and more than 100 colonels. The Austrian army is effectively destroyed as a fighting force. The Russians are in full retreat toward their own borders. The strategic implications were staggering. With a single day's fighting, Napoleon had eliminated the most serious threat to French dominance in Europe. The Third Coalition, which had seemed so formidable just months before, was broken beyond repair. Austria would be forced to accept terms that would reduce it to a second-rate power, while Russia would withdraw into isolation to lick its wounds. "The son of Austerlitz," Napoleon murmured, unconsciously echoing the phrase that would become forever associated with his greatest triumph. "It has burned away more than morning mist." Through the window, he could see French soldiers moving across the battlefield with torches, continuing the grim work of collecting the wounded and identifying the dead. It was necessary work, the unglamorous aftermath of glorious victory, but it reminded him that war was ultimately about human suffering rather than strategic brilliance. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. Marshal Duroc entered with news that Austrian negotiators were ready to discuss terms for an immediate armistice. The preliminary talks with Prince Liechtenstein had gone well, and Francis I was apparently prepared to accept harsh terms rather than see his remaining forces destroyed in further fighting. "They're beaten, sire," Duroc reported. "Completely beaten. The Austrian emperor is ready to make peace on almost any terms that allow him to keep his throne. Napoleon finally turned from the window, his decision made. Very well. We'll discuss terms tomorrow. Tonight, let them contemplate what they've lost. Sometimes anticipation of punishment is more effective than the punishment itself. As his marshals withdrew to make the necessary arrangements, Napoleon returned to his contemplation of the battlefield beyond the window. The day that had begun with uncertainty and mist had ended with clarity and triumph. But he understood better than most that victory in war was only the beginning of new challenges in peace. The Europe that emerged from Austerlitz would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed that morning. The old order, based on the balance of power between roughly equal great powers, had been shattered forever. In its place would emerge a new system dominated by French power and shaped by French interests, but also bearing the responsibility for maintaining stability across a continent that had known little peace for more than a decade. Napoleon Bonaparte, the artillery officer who had become an emperor, now found himself master of a European empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the borders of Russia. It was an achievement that surpassed even his own ambitious dreams, but it was also a burden that would test every aspect of his genius in the years to come. The sun had set over the field of Austerlitz, but its light would illuminate European history for generations to come. December 2nd, 1805, would be remembered as the day when one man's genius had reshaded the map of Europe and established a new order that would endure until other, greater conflicts swept it away. But for now, in the quiet of a winter evening in Moravia, Napoleon Bonaparte could savor the completeness of his triumph. He had fought the perfect battle, executed the perfect strategy, and achieved the perfect victory. The boy from Corsica had become the master of Europe, and the sun of Austerlitz would shine in French memory forever. In the hospitals and aid stations scattered across the battlefield, wounded soldiers from both armies slowly healed or quietly died, their individual stories becoming footnotes to the great narrative of imperial triumph. The farmers of Moravia would return to find their fields fertilized with the blood of empires, their peaceful countryside forever marked by the geography of genius. And in the years to come, when old soldiers gathered in taverns and around firesides to tell stories of the wars they had fought, they would speak of Austerlitz with the reverence reserved for perfect things. They would remember the morning mist that had concealed the emperor's trap, the brilliant maneuver that had seized the commanding heights, and the devastating pursuit that had completed the enemy's destruction. They would remember, most of all, the feeling of being part of something greater than themselves, of contributing to a victory so complete and brilliant that it would echo through history like thunder rolling across the plains. They had been present at the creation of a legend, witnesses to the moment when strategy became art and war became poetry. The Battle of Austerlitz was over, but its legacy would endure as long as men studied the art of war and marveled at the heights that human genius could reach when combined with courage, preparation, and the ability to see opportunity where others saw only danger. The sun of Austerlitz had set, but its light would shine forever in the annals of military history, illuminating the path for future generations of soldiers and strategists who would study this perfect battle and wonder at the mind that had conceived it. Napoleon Bonaparte had achieved immortality on the fields of Moravia, and Europe would never be the same.